Welcome to Let's Talk Democracy, the show where we have meaningful conversations on democracy. I'm your host, Tina Johnson. And each week, we're joined by people who are doing the hard work of building healthy democratic environments. With insightful guests, expert advice, and thought-provoking conversations, we dive deep into the heart of democracy. Whether you're here to learn or to get inspired, we've got something for you. Let's jump in and explore today's episode. In societies like the United States, where democracy promises a separation of church and state, those lines are increasingly blurred, raising questions about the integrity of our governance. Today, I'm joined by Swarthmore theology professor and author of When God Was a Bird, Mark Wallace, for a powerful conversation about the intersection of faith and democracy and how religion shapes it. From Jesus' radical vision of equality to Paul's strategic alignment with empire, we trace the roots of modern political movements like Christian nationalism and ask what this means for the future of democratic values such as freedom, justice, and equality. Let's get into it. Hi, Mark. Thank you for joining me on my podcast today. I wanted to talk to you because of the work that you do, both as a professor of theology, but also as an activist, as well as a writer and a thinker, and to have a discussion with you around the role of religion in our democracy today. And I was thinking about who I wanted to talk to about this, and I thought you, because of your very open perspective on the role of religion in the world. And I just wanted to kind of just open up our conversation around just your initial thoughts on the role of religion, in particular conservative religion, in American democracy at the moment, and what you think that's about.
Let's talk a little bit about the Christian religion, and then we can talk about other religious traditions as well. It's a little difficult to talk about religion in a kind of sui generis way generically, but we can talk about a particular tradition, Christianity, because it continues to have an outsized influence in not just American, but also global politics. And talk about that, and then we can talk about other traditions as well. The problem, I think, with understanding conservative religion now in terms of American and global Christianity is that there are two tributaries, so to speak, that make up the great flow of the Christian religion. One comes out of the tradition of Jesus in the New Testament. It looks, by the way, that looks like that Jesus was an historical individual based on extra biblical attestations to his teachings and his ministry and then his death by crucifixion. So I think we can reasonably assume that Jesus was an historical person. But be that as it may, that those portraits of Jesus, both in the canonical New Testament, also extra canonical material, sets up a portrait of an individual who was a colonized person, who was along with his family and his community, under the occupation of the Roman Empire. And so he had a very conflicted and complicated relationship to occupation. He was homeless. He seemed to be itinerant. That is, he wandered from place to place. He didn't have an income. He rejected a lot of conventional social mores about what it meant to be a respectable, responsible person. So Jesus was a homeless or a houseless person. He wandered from place to place. His family thought that he was mentally challenged. So in that early portrait of what became the Christian religion, Jesus himself was an individual under occupation, living on the fringes of society. And out of that tradition, early Christianity, as a fledgling cultural movement, practiced a kind of primitive communism. Followers of Jesus in the first generation pooled all their resources together, gave it to the leaders of the community, and then those resources were redistributed. That was one trajectory or one genetic heritage that made up early Christianity. But there was another one. Around the time of Jesus' death, one of his most ardent followers was an apostle named Paul. And Paul had a different vision as to how the fledgling Christian movement should be set up. Paul courted wealthy patrons to finance early Christianity. And he also worked hard to endear the Christian movement to the Roman authorities at the time. So the then empire that was occupying what is today Israel, Palestine, Paul saw that the early Christian movement would be best served by encouraging Christians to be good citizens of the empire. Jesus had a much more complicated and conflicted relationship with the empire than did Paul. So Paul wrote in his letters to the early Christians in the imperial city of Rome, he wrote that early followers of Jesus should be loyal subjects of the Roman authority because that authority has been ordained by God to serve the interest of early Christians. This is a very different vision from how Jesus operated in his relationship to the Roman authorities. The reason I mention this is that these two genetic heritages, or these two tributaries that make up the great river of the Christian movement as it developed, pushed Christianity into two different directions. On the one hand, you had sort of moral and political opposition to occupation. That became the Christian movement that we think of today as, in its contemporary expression, as political theology or liberation theology, forms of Christian expression that are ethically guided to resist the imposition of empire on people, including Christian people. But the other trajectory opened Christianity up to becoming a kind of legitimation structure for empire, for government, for political authority. That's the Pauline tradition, not the Jesus tradition. But the Pauline tradition, following the Apostle Paul, saw the Christian movement as needing to be a kind of support structure that would legitimize and even sanctify the ruling authorities. Within 300 or 400 years after the early Christian movement got started, Christianity, because of a Roman emperor named Constantine, Christianity became the religion of the empire. It was officially sanctioned by the Roman authorities as the religion best suited to advance the interests of the then empire, that was the Roman Empire. And so for roughly 1,500 years in the Common Era, from the time of Jesus to roughly 500 years ago, the Christian religion was seen as a support structure for the empire. That began to change with the Protestant Reformation, but to update that to today, we have today then this tension between Christians who resist empire and what has become the Christian church's sort of defining feature today, in what Christianity is, I think, best known for today, how Christianity today has become the legitimation structure for now the American empire. So we had the Pax Romana, we had the peace of Rome, so to speak, that was imposed on Roman subjects, and now we have the Pax, P-A-X, Pax Americana. We have the global domination of the American empire and the vision of many conservative Christians that the role of Christianity is to aid and abet the interests of the empire, because the aims of the empire and the aims of the Christian church are one. That's a kind of overall structure for understanding the role of conservative religion in America and globally today.
And I hadn't thought about the two divergent paths of Christianity, one being that of the teachings and the path of Jesus Christ, and then the one being the path of Paul. So I think that history is an important frame for understanding the divergence of where we are today. And you mentioned that there are those Christians who are opposed to empire, and then there are those Christians who support empire. And that seems like where we are today in what is being called, and I agree, the conservative religious right is pushed towards having empire or the wealthy to control the nation state that we live in exchange for what? Right? Like with crisis, in exchange for the caring and the support of one another, taking care of thy neighbor. And the Christians who want empire are not serving the mission of the scriptures, but serving the mission of power.
Yes, I agree with you. If you look at Christianity as largely flowing out of the Jesus tradition and Jesus's own opposition to empire and his resistance to oppression, and you're right, Tina, his central message to love God and love your neighbor as you would love yourself. So at one point he was queried on, what's the essence of your message? Summarize your whole teaching. Tell us what your central vision for the world is. And he said it's two things. It's love of God and love of neighbor. It's pretty clear that that's Jesus's central teaching. He doesn't talk about empire. He doesn't talk about the need to support political authority. But the other tradition, and I'm not saying the Apostle Paul was wrong. I'm saying that Paul understood that most likely the early Christian movement would have been, it's an ugly image, but it would have been strangled in the cradle if Paul hadn't found common cause with political elites and with financial elites. And he was very masterful at this. He was a kind of religious organization man. And so he went in a different direction from the direction Jesus was going. And that cemented Christianity's reputation in the early years of the Christian movement as a reliable participant in Roman civic life. It could be counted on to support the empire, to support the emperor. What that has meant today then is that, for example, in the founding of the United States came together as a place of refuge for religious dissidents. Many of those dissidents saw what became the United States as a city on a hill. I'm quoting here the Gospel of Matthew. As a city on a hill, as a light to the nations, as the salt of the earth. That the United States had a special divine mandate, manifest destiny, to articulate and enact the values of democracy, of religious freedom, and of love of neighbor in the Jesus tradition, and that this was for the United States, this was its distinctive civic and religious mission. The problem became then that many religious leaders became very, very close to political elites, to government officials, in order to articulate and enact this vision of a city on a hill, a light to the nations. And in doing so, often compromise the distinctiveness of their Christian beliefs in the service of the state, or what I would call in the service of the empire. In the 20th century, probably the Protestant evangelist Billy Graham is the best known individual who perfected that sort of careful cultivating of a relationship with political elites. And now in the 21st century, early on, it was also a 20th century movement called the moral majority, also held by Protestant pastors. But today it's probably best identified with Donald Trump, the American president, who has been a master, a virtuoso at understanding the sort of DNA of this special alliance, this genetic heritage between Christian leaders and political elites, and has exploited that genetic heritage to serve his own ends, and in turn serve the ends of, I would call them Christian conservatives, but to be more specific today in particular, I would call them Christian nationalists. I would call them people who really see the mission of the United States and the mission of the Christian churches as one. And so Trump, in alliance with these religious nationalists, has been able to be the high priest of this new form of American religion, form of religion that has its genetic heritage in the Pauline tradition, but it's now coming into the fore as a distinctive expression of that tradition in this alliance between Trump and Christian nationalism.
Yeah, I think one of the tenets of the form, as you just called it, of the Pauline Christianity, which we'll call in today's reality Christian nationalism, is the fact that it has taken on this shape. It's different than the Pauline tradition, right? It's not the same as to support the empire and fulfilling its duty. I think of the Roman Empire as an empire that realized that we have to find a way to be inclusive of our society, even though we have class distinctions. We need to figure out ways in which people feel like they can be a part of the society, even though they might have different levels of accessibility, that we're all Romans. It seems like the Christian nationalists have a sense of they are the ones who get to determine who has access to the governance framework of the United States, or what policies will be enacted so that folks who don't fall within that same framework, that they have less access and fewer rights. It has moved more towards an extreme version. The question I have for you is, where in the scriptures is this taught? Is this advocated for? Is it a requirement that there is inequality within a society for it to be Christian or to be based off of the teachings of Christ? Where does that exist, and how does the Christian nationalist reconcile the teachings of Christ with the ideology that inequality, inaccessibility to a large majority of people is okay?
Right, right. So that's a really good question. And you've spoken to the, I think, core issue, which is the tension, just to talk about the Christian scriptures or the New Testament, to talk about the New Testament in this way. What you see is very hard fought and contested tension between Jesus's teachings about equality and Paul's understanding that for Christianity to move forward, it had to move into an alliance with the empire. The best place to see this is the fifth book in the New Testament. It's called the Book of Acts, and it's a book that provides, allegedly, a historical record of the early Christian movement. In that early Christian movement, you have, I alluded to this earlier, the practice of what you might call primitive communism. Everyone took whatever they had, rich or poor. In the tensions of the New Testament and the Book of Acts, the ethnic tensions between Hebrew or Jewish followers of Jesus and non-Jewish followers of Jesus, called Gentiles. So you have this early ethnic tension between these two groups. But aside from these ethnic and economic demographies that produce tension and conflict, you had the early Christian movement as insisting by the followers of Jesus that everything get put into a common pot, all of one's assets, money, real estate, etc., be put into a common pot and then redistributed equally to everyone else, from each according to their surplus, to each according to their need. But that early communist movement, you could call it religious socialism if you want to call it that, failed in the book of Acts. People complained bitterly that they weren't getting enough. Some got too much in the redistribution of wealth, some got too little. So what emerges in the book of Acts and then in the rest of the New Testament is Paul's vision of courting political and social elites, wealthy individuals, to become patrons of the early Christian movement. They would donate a certain amount of their own wealth to the fledgling Christian movement, and then Paul and his followers would redistribute that. This caused a lot of tensions, and the New Testament is full of those tensions. But what happens then as the New Testament starts to shut down, it was written over the space of many decades, but as the New Testament starts to close towards the end of the first century of the Common Era, so this is roughly 60, 70 years after the time of Jesus. As the New Testament starts to close down, it starts to advocate for a hierarchical understanding of religious authority. So you start to have bishops, and then you have priests, and then you have so-called lay people. And that movement towards religious authority enabled in the early Christian movement to not only court economic and social elites, but also political elites. And so as the New Testament closes down, Christianity becomes a hierarchical movement. It abandons primitive communism, and it starts to ally itself with political authorities in the Roman Empire. And that strain of, let's call it hierarchical Christianity, that strain has been a common emphasis within 2,000 years of the Christian movement, such that today we have that strain now dominating politically and economically the majority Christian understanding of how Christians should operate, not only internal to their churches, but in relation to political elite.
The question that comes to mind for me is in our modern reality, where we are with history framing the context of how we've come to Christian nationalism. How is it that this American nation state, where we have a separation of state and church,
Right.
it seems like we're blurring that line quite
Yes.
heavily today.
Mm-hmm.
And, you spoke about the dissidents who came. I mean, I'm from the state of Pennsylvania, the home of the Quakers, the first colony of the 13 original colonies that was settled by William Penn from England, who was given a charter to leave England to allow for the Quakers to be able to pursue their own form of religious practice away from the Protestant practice of the Church of England. And several other churches followed suit. And it's a basic tenet of the Constitution of why people left the old world to come to the new world was to be free from religious persecution.
Right.
And now today, we're seeing Christian nationalists persecute
Right.
people, not just based on religion. Don't be a Muslim in America. Don't be transgender in America. Don't be gay. Don't be anything that they haven't decided is worthy of their religious ideology. And
Right.
that runs right up against that important tenet of separation of church and state. I think a lot of people are trying to understand how we got here, where for so many people, it's okay to have church and state so intertwined in such a twisted, mangled redefining of what the United States stands for. Now it says the country of Christians, when it's always been a country of free people. Well, free
Yeah,
men, let's start there, but it's supposed to be in its aspiration for free people, for
right.
free thought, for freedom of religion. It's a freedom. And it seems that that freedom has now been hijacked by
Hmm.
the Christian nationalists to say, no, 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 that is not what we stand for, when it's actually everything that this country was started with and for. I mean, I'm
Yes,
leaving out the extraction and all the other things, but I'm just speaking to the democratic formation of the United States right now. And
right.
I'm trying to, and if you could help me unpack that, I would really appreciate it. Like,
What you've said all makes sense, Tina, and you're absolutely right that in the United States founding constitutional documents, it's clear, I'll paraphrase those documents, that government is not allowed to make any laws with respect to establishing religion. That is, the state would say, this is the religion that we support as opposed to this one. So we support Christianity versus Islam, for example. So the government isn't allowed to, in our constitutional documents, to set up any laws that would establish religion, nor is it allowed to set up any laws that would discourage or banish the practice of religion as a free choice, as you rightly put it, as a free choice of free people making their own faith-based religious community decision. That's up to the individual and up to particular groups how they want to do that, if they want to espouse religion at all. So what's happened? Part of the problem is that while constitutionally there is this wedge or divide or wall between church and state that's in the country's founding constitutional charter, on the other hand, what's clear from the beginning of the United States and the example of Pennsylvania as having been settled by a factional group of religious dissenters called Quakers, what's clear is that from the time of its founding to the present, while church and state have been separated constitutionally, religion and politics have always been meshed together. So that's the confusion. We have this wall of partition between church and state, but we have always been a country that has mixed together in a variety of different ways the practice of religion on the one hand and the practice of politics on the other. This becomes a problem when a particular religious group, in this case conservative nationalist Christianity, gets the upper hand in the political arena, which we now have under the Trump administration. And let's just take one example of how this might play out now after Trump's been in power for a month or two. What's most likely for Trump and his people to do, let's just take the issue of primary and secondary education. The Trump people will abolish the Department of Education. They will reassign some of its responsibilities to other branches of government. But the Department of Education, which ensures, at least in principle, the equitable distribution of education resources to all states and all groups, that gets abolished. And now what will likely happen is that particular Christian groups that support private parochial religious education will get funding from the state or funding from the national government to bring about their own fusion of religion and education. So money will be taken away from public education, what the Trump people call government education. Money will be taken away from public education and will be handed over to sectarian groups. Not only does this legitimize those sectarian groups as now operating under the imprimatur of the imperial American state, so they get that special recognition, but it'll also most likely badly undermine financially the practice of public education as we've known it in the United States. So that's just one example of this, that once you move towards this perfect alliance between Christian nationalism and political authority, then you get the practice of education in such a way that one particular group gets favored, Christian nationalists, over and against all the other groups. We still have the official separation of church and state, but we've mixed together religion and politics in a way that makes this new reality, which I'm suggesting is likely to happen, which will make this new reality very, very possible in the near future.
One of these things that you brought up around the Pauline approach to aligning itself with the elite, and the elite, those with money and people with political power, that before Trump, there was this push to make every school system have some charter pathway for education. And so it seems like the Christian nationalists are playing into the privatization of our education system in the United States to the benefit of the wealthy, because they're the ones who can afford to build these schools. Taxpayers still need to pay their taxes for education, but now they're given to private individuals, which is the system currently exists. So I'm going to put in air quotes, the Christian rights ideals of having faith-based education. At the same time, what they're saying, and we're going to make it so that the elite, those who have the resources to buy land, build schools, will have unlimited access to those resources that everyone else who may not be part of this Christian nationalist space has to pay for. So It seems like there is this very interesting alignment between creating wealth for people who don't need it under the guise of creating a conservative Christian movement towards centering Christ, right, in our education systems at the expense of the majority of people who don't want that.
Right.
Because that's not either their belief system, or they believe that public education should be accessible without being pressed down upon with someone else's religious belief system. So the Christian, I almost said white nationalist, the Christian conservative movement is really pushing for privatization of a public institution without thought of how that really impacts the people that they say they want to serve. I'm struggling with this movement because they seem to be undermining the very tenets of the things that they believe. They're okay with handing over the purse strings to those who do not need a purse. They already have it. They're just giving them more resources and then calling it a Christian ideal.
Yes, that's correct. And the economic model for me would be a move away from fair distribution of resources to everyone, going back historically, what I called Christianity's first experiment in communism or socialism. So it would move away from that ideal, which has been part of the American ideal, but it would also move away from the idea of creating a tax code and an economic system that benefits economic elites, and based on their amass of great wealth, somehow through that process, wealth would trickle down to other people who don't have those advantages. This to me is a third model beyond socialism or democratic socialism and beyond trickle down economics. This is a trickle up approach. This is taking the public purse, as you're putting it, and using it to finance wealthy people's ambitions to serve their own families and communities at the expense of everyone else. That to me is such a significant departure from the first two models, the democratic socialist and the trickle down models, that we're now entering a period of, to me, terrifying cultural and religious and economic implications. So, for example, with public education, this would be the abandonment of the ideal of public education as providing a level playing field in which young people get inculcated into the ideals of democracy. That gets shunted aside now. This is why many religious nationalists don't refer to the United States as a democracy anymore, but as a republic. The reason they call it a republic is they want to bake into America's laws and practices forms of government that privilege some people and not others. And this will mean that America's schools, not only along economic, but also very importantly along racial lines, will get resegregated again. So that oftentimes people of color from under-resourced communities who don't have the financial resources to buy into this private education model, their children will be saddled with attending underfunded urban, suburban, rural schools that have been left behind by this push to support financially elite Christian nationalism. That is the model that's moving apace right now.
But that's the model that's been moving apace for years now. We call it the school to prison pipeline.
Right.
It's referencing back to the charter school when the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans happened. After the cleanup and people were going back to the city, public schools didn't open, charter schools opened. That's what replaced the public school system there. Charter schools. Instead of it just being a push by privateers, it's now being aligned with the government action that is overt in saying we're now going to make this the new normal of how we redistribute funds in such an inequitable way, more so than we've allowed for before. There's so many scriptures that say don't do things that make it tough for other people. And yet this is the Christian nationalist perspective, not just in education, but it's also in access to health care. It's also in access to reproductive rights.
Right.
We have a constitutional crisis is what the language is right now with Donald Trump in the White House. But we also have a moral crisis of what we say we believe as citizens of the United States. Where are the opportunities to right this imbalance, to get us back on track where we are the land that really does believe in and uphold the freedoms of every person?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. And I think asking the question, where's the leverage now to begin to resist the imposition of theocracy, of religious totalitarianism, of Christian nationalism, white Christian supremacy? Where are the points of leverage to resist this imposition? Where are the points of leverage to resist this domination system? I look at past popular uprising against, at times, tyrannical imperialist American state. And so whether that's trade unionism or suffragism in the early part of the 20th century, or the then called gay rights or civil rights movements of the latter part of the 20th century, or movements in the 21st century like Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter, that these movements, and there are others as well, but these movements came about because government overplayed its hand in oppressing people, large masses of people, and betraying the fundamental democratic ideals of the American experiment. And that's what I think we're leading up to now. I don't think history is a march towards freedom and justice. I wish that were the case, but I don't think the record indicates that. I think history oscillates, and American history oscillates between bending towards justice at times and oppressing large groups of people to serve the interest of particular elites at other times. Right now, we're in a period of the elites having the upper hand. And I think what that will do, it will trigger a backlash against these elites by people of conscience and good faith who will resist the imposition of tyranny on large masses of people. I don't know, Tina, what that's going to look like. But on that point, I'm really confident that people will put their life, their well-being, their economic future, they will put that on the line as they join hands with other people in solidarity against tyranny. And we're in a tyrannical period, and it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. And then there will be popular uprisings to resist that tyranny.
I was at a march in DC right before just last week, when the day that Trump was giving his unsolicited, unofficial State of the Union address, to sort of beat back the criticism that's happening for the Republicans who are being chastised by their constituents for what's going on and what's happened in the last month since he's taken office. And that is something that echoed with me, was the fact that every day in DC and across the country, there are protests and people are coming together and really trying to find that moment where they build this momentum towards that uprising.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I'm hopeful that that is going to happen. But I'm also hopeful that folks realize that they have a chance in 18 months to really do something in the House and in the Senate. You know, the 435 seats are up in the House for reelection. People can vote in Democrats, good Democrats who will hold that House, the budget process, the committee process, the offices that are held by those who are now heads of departments for the United States accountable, and that the Senate, if it were to flip to the Democrats and we would have a majority there, a lot of things could be stymied, and some of the damage could be rolled back. So I do think that that is one first opportunity that people have, is to get out and vote as well. And I do think organizing, because I do think out of the ashes that are falling down around the U.S. in this moment, there are opportunities also for us to move towards a more perfect union, to be more aspirational, even though it feels that we are in this desperate state of not knowing how to react or what to react to. We are a country of freedoms that should be extended to every person because we are all worthy of those freedoms.
This is where I think, even though we've talked today about the impact of toxic nationalist religion on our body politic, but religion can also be an incredibly powerful force for change and renewal in the midst of this time of despair. What religion offers is a vision. Use the word aspirational, and I really think that's important. Religion doesn't operate in the registry of optimism. It operates in the registry of hope. Hope is the belief in things not seen. It's the confidence in things not quite envisioned yet. And so what religion can do, and in particular in its healthy moments, not in its sick-minded, toxic moments, but in its healthy moments, the Christian religion can provide vision and language and emotional resources for committing oneself to the long haul, being hopeful for change, but not optimistic because one doesn't know for certain that things will change, but one lives in that attitudinal disposition of hope and belief and trust that together we can make for change. And I just think that that's what sustains people, whether they're religious or not. That kind of language, the language of hope, sustains people for the long haul in resistance movements. Otherwise, you just burn out because you don't have the emotional or the spiritual resources to keep doing this. right? Because prima facie things look so bad. And right now they really look bad. This is a very troubling time. But healthy spirituality, healthy religion, including the Christian religion, can provide those resources for long-term sustainable commitment.
I really appreciate you saying that, because I do think that with that healthy spiritualism, that it roots us and it provides us with opportunities to be hopeful when we're feeling despair. And I know, talking to many people, that that's an overwhelming feeling, not just in the United States, but globally. And so I want to say thank you for just pointing that out, because at the end of the day, that is one of those opportunities that we have, is to root ourselves in the aspiration and the hope of what we know is possible,
Yes.
and not just focus on the thing that is, because
Right.
this can change. And so I appreciate you. I appreciate that word.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for spending some time with me today, Mark. I really enjoyed having this conversation with you.
Thank you, Tina. This is wonderful. And it's, I hope for us and for anyone listening in on the podcast, this can be mutually encouraging. We really need that right now.
I agree. There's a lot of bad things, but also a lot of good things going on at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Today, we journey through the complex intersection of Christianity and politics, from the early divide between Jesus' anti-imperial stance and Paul's strategic collaboration with Roman authorities, to the rise of Christian nationalism in the modern political landscape. We also discuss challenges to the core values of democracy and the original teachings of love and neighborly care, and how religious power can both uphold and undermine democratic ideals. If you enjoyed this episode, take a moment to subscribe and share this conversation with someone who might find it thought-provoking. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Leave a review or send an email at tina@patternchangelab.com. Your feedback is always appreciated. Join me next week when I'm in conversation with Jim Boyce on the economics of democracy. You won't want to miss it.